This message is brought to you by North Ringwood Uniting Church, a God-focused, grace-filled community helping you grow. We hope you enjoy.
Good Christian people stand back and alone. So I'm going to sit as well because I haven't been very well. Pretty much all that's left is a bit of sore throat and I sound a bit funny. So I like to be prepared, so I've just got everything with me just in case, but I should be alright. Alright, so we begin Ruth today. Without reading any of the verses from chapter 1, is there anything that people can tell me, any singular maybe words or anything like that that you feel describe just the first chapter? I'm not talking about all of it, just the first chapter. No. I know, I left that up there too long tonight. Tragedy, that's a good word. It's a real story. Yep, that's a good point. Thank you for that. Anything else? Respect. Oh, that's nice. Cool.
All right. Because today I wanted to sort of think about the fact that we often skip ahead when we're really familiar with stories, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with Ruth, but you probably have some idea of the story. Is there anyone who hasn't ever read it or heard it at all? See, that's what I expected, that we all have some idea of it. But it can be a real trap for us that we get stuck in thinking that we know the stories and in not actually thinking about what all the stages are because we know the ending. And we know how it ends up, and we know that it works out okay. But it doesn't mean that we should actually ignore the journey to get there. I know that journey is such an overused word, but it is applicable and it works well. So let's just go with it.
Once upon a time, in the land, God had given his people, the Israelites. Sometime during the time of the judges, there was a famine. This famine, while severe, was not too widespread. And so a man named Elimelech from Bethlehem, along with his wife Naomi and their two sons Mahlon and Chilion, decided to move to Moab, where there was no famine. In the Moabite land they prospered for some time, but the family experienced more tragedy when Elimelech died, leaving Naomi and her two sons. The two sons decided to marry two Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. However, there was more tragedy to come, when 10 years after they had left Bethlehem, Mahlon and Chilion also died. Naomi was now a widow who was left also without her sons. She had lost her family, her means of support, and her livelihood. In this time of great distress, Naomi heard that the Lord had blessed her hometown of Bethlehem, that the famine had lifted, and so she decided to leave Moab, the place that was meant to be her family's salvation, but that now held nothing for her. She decided to return to her own people, a place where she, a lone elderly widow, might be more likely to find some charity and support. She no longer owned much, nor had much to organise, and so when she had made this decision, she was able to leave quite quickly, heading back along the road to Bethlehem in the land of Judea. As was the custom of the time, her two daughters-in-law were living with her, and so accompanied her, intending to follow her back to Bethlehem. However, not far down the road, Naomi, who wanted only the best for her daughters-in-law, turned to Ruth and Orpah and said, Go back home and live with your mother again, and may God treat you as graciously as you have treated your deceased husbands and me. May God give each of you a new home and a new husband. She kissed them and cried, but knew they had a greater chance of finding new husbands in their own land. But Orpah and Ruth both said, No, we will go with you to your people. But Naomi truly believed they would be much better off in their own land with their own people and their own faiths and customs, and so insisted they return, Go back, my dear daughters. Why would you come with me? What life can I offer you? I have no husband, and even if I was to get a husband tomorrow, I can have no more children. And even if I could and conceive tomorrow, would you really want to wait until my sons are grown? Do you really want to wait that long to get married again? It greatly pains me to lose you, for I have already lost so much. But you must return, for I have nothing to offer you. You still have a chance to begin again. This is much more bitter for me than for you, for the Lord has turned against me. I have no way to support myself, let alone you as well." Again they cried, distressed. And then Orpah, understanding why her mother-in-law was sending her home, kissed her goodbye and did what Naomi had asked of her, and she began the journey back to her homeland. But Ruth would not go. She embraced Naomi and stayed with her. Naomi said to Ruth, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to live with her own people, her own gods in her own land. Go back with her." But Ruth, even knowing how uncertain life would be with Naomi, said to her, "Don't ask me to leave you again. Let me go with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and that is where I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." After such a speech, Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to stay with her, and grateful for the company and for some remaining family, she gave in, and no more was said about it. And so the two women continued together as a family on their journey to Bethlehem. When they finally arrived, walking into the streets of Bethlehem, the whole town was quickly buzzing with the news of Naomi's return. People came out to see her, wondering, "Is this really the Naomi that we know, after all this time?" But when they spoke to Naomi, she said, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Lord Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I left full of life and hope and a family, and I have returned empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord does not, for my life is not pleasant? The Lord has caused me to suffer and sent such tragedy upon me." And so Naomi, accompanied by her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth, returned from Moab in late spring, the beginning of the barley harvest. Once upon a time in the land, God...
Once is enough, thank you. I put that together when I knew that the sore throat was coming on, just so I didn't have to do it all tonight. So it's a slightly embellished version, but kind of at the same time reasonably accurate, taken from a few different sources with a few different things thrown in there. But Ruth and Naomi were living this story without any knowledge of the end. This was where they were for probably a little bit of time in this really uncertain place. And I know that I'm always tempted to read this story knowing that the loyalty that Ruth was showing Naomi is used by God for great things. Even though when she said those words, while really kind and generous and certainly very loyal to Naomi and to her late husband, they could have almost been viewed as a little bit irrational given what the options were. By staying with Naomi, she was continuing life as a widow with no immediate prospects for remarriage, with an even older widow as her family, in a strange town with no known family, no land, no livelihood, no job, in a time where widows were the lowest of the low. And I think Naomi was trying really hard to give her daughters-in-law, who she clearly loved, a really good chance at a new life by telling them to return home and telling them that they no longer need to feel indebted to her as her family. For her, she knew that life was going to be difficult and uncertain, and she really wanted to spare them that. Because we know the end of the story, sometimes it might be tempting to gloss over the real despair and distress that is experienced in this chapter. In her words, her distress is palpable. She is really angry with God. She feels abandoned by God, and she isn't afraid to tell it like it is. It is the very first thing that she mentions when she returns home. She's really living in her grief and her fear and her uncertainty. And actually expressing anger at God or acknowledging our confusion can sometimes be really difficult even within the church, because we're not sure how others are perhaps going to react We think that other people might think that we're doing something wrong or that we've actually turned away from God. But I think that being angry with God is okay, so long as we are still angry at God, because that means we're still acknowledging him as God. We're just expressing an emotion. We're saying, I don't understand, I don't know what to do, and we're asking, why is this going on? But we are still actually searching for God in those answers and in those questions. We are still open, and in a sense, I think, waiting for God to do something about that. We just have to learn to sit in that waiting. And I think this is what Naomi is doing. This is what Job did too. He sat in the dirt for days and complained. He had some pretty specific things to say to God in that time. But it was always to God and acknowledging that God was God. Neither Naomi nor Job actually turned away. The thing that really stood out for me, rereading this chapter again, is the friendship of Naomi and Ruth. A friendship that possibly solidifies in a really brand new way in this chapter. Clearly they had a relationship before, but when Ruth declares that she will stay with Naomi, she's beginning a new kind of relationship with this older woman who probably before had only been her mother-in-law. No matter how good the relationship had been, there'd always been the husband, so they were a different sort of family. But he's no longer there now. Naomi displays her love for her two daughters-in-law by telling them to return home. I think Orpah honours Naomi by obeying her, and Ruth displays great loyalty by staying with Naomi. And by doing this, I think Naomi and Ruth possibly begin to develop a relationship on this journey, to develop their relationship on this journey back to Bethlehem. Given that we do actually know what happens next, we could infer a bit that Naomi probably brought to this relationship a whole lot of knowledge and faith about God and wisdom to their relationship. And given that it was Ruth who went out into the fields, Ruth probably brought youth and enthusiasm. Naomi would also have had to have informed Ruth of the customs of the Jewish people and about her faith. She would have had to have told her what to expect, what would have been expected of her as a widow and as a Jewish person, and how to live within the town. We don't know if Ruth had been following the Jewish traditions and faith while she was still in Moab. It's a bit uncertain. But she may not have been. This might have been the turning point of deciding to follow. Not only was she going to stay with Naomi, but take on a brand new faith. Or it might have been a time when her faith developed even more as she decided to stay with Naomi. And so as I read this, I began to wonder if maybe this was the start of a holy friendship, a concept we don't actually talk about very much, but a friendship that is more than just catching up and enjoying each other's company. It's a friendship that is deeply invested, that is involved in each other at a spiritual level, and that is concerned about each other's well-being enough to actually follow through in real deep and lasting and long commitments. Holy friendship is a mutual relationship that develops virtue and enhances holiness. So that's really all I have to say, and that's what I want to reflect on. And we're going to have a time of reflection in a moment. I want to have a time of reflection about these two main points: the contrast between the intense despair and the idea of encouragement in God. Or really, if there's anything else that's come up to reflect for you, then reflect upon that, that's fine. But what I'm going to put to you are two ideas: that in our times of despair, because we all go through them at some point, we need to hold on to the friendship or the encouragements that allow us to be within our despair and our anger and our uncertainty at life and at God, but those things that don't simply allow us to wallow in them, but instead strive to help us through these times, but without denying them. In our despair, we need to remember. We're often encouraged in the Bible to remember. In fact, the whole Bible is there so we can remember our history and the story of God's people. This sort of remembering is a remembering of events that we haven't actually experienced, and yet it's a story that we become a part of as we are the children of God. Because it is actually God's story that we are living. It's not our story, it's God's story. We become part of this larger story. But it is also important to remember our own personal stories. We can remember what we have experienced before, and it can be important to do this really specifically sometimes. Because in those times of despair, those good things are really hard to sort of pull out of our brain and our memory. When we're in despair, that's all we see. The world is black, and that's all we can feel. But if we dig around a little bit, God can bring to the forefront of our mind the people and the times when we were encouraged. So I want to invite you to think about the people that God has put within your life that has encouraged you at some time. Maybe it is an ongoing friendship and you're very fortunate to be part of something that you could perhaps classify as a holy friendship. But maybe it's a particular book or an author that you read. Maybe it's a single conversation that stands out in your mind, or a single moment, or something quite miraculous. But it doesn't have to be big. It can be those tiny moments. It can be those tiny moments that we can think of now, or if you are in the midst of your own despair, perhaps reluctantly think about, but search your mind and your memory for. Because they can offer you glimpses of God in these times of despair. So what I'm going to do is there's paper on these tables, but I'm going to hand some around anyway. There's pens here and on the tables. So I'm going to invite you on one side of the piece of paper that if you want to write down any words or sentences or massive long paragraphs of venting, depending on wherever you are sitting right at this moment in life, to describe those times of despair or those things that are more difficult in life. But then on the other side, I want you to think about those people or the words of encouragement or those books or the authors or whatever it is that have been an encouragement for you. And if you're not in despair, if you are in a reasonable place and you're feeling all right, it's just as worth to do this, because then you've actually made the conscious remembering act of remembering those good things, which is a good thing to do anyway, but to actually really specifically think about them and write them down, I'm pretty sure will help you when times do get a bit tougher, because you've made that effort to really think about them, to acknowledge them and to thank God for them. So the people or the times that you are grateful for, but then on the other side, the things that perhaps you're not so grateful for, but that we go through anyway. Because I think that we are able to hold these two opposing things in our lives, and God is certainly a God who can hold these two apparently opposing things in our lives for us. And I think as Christians, it is important to learn how to struggle with our faith, with our life, and the difficulties in life within the church family, even though you're kind of doing it privately, but it's still a recognition that this is what happens in life. We can both acknowledge God as God and be in despair at the same time. They don't cancel each other out. They are simply part of life. So, I encourage you then to take this piece of paper away as an act of remembering as well. But also I'm going to have a short time of silence, and then the band's going to come up and they're going to play for a bit, and then you'll be invited to sing. But during that time, during the silence, which doesn't have to be completely silent, it's just not me talking, but I encourage you to write down whatever it is. But also there's some candles that if you want to get up, whether now or during the singing, and light a candle. We do things like lighting candles for part of the same reason that we do things like singing and communion in a way, because participating in physical acts can help us remember. They are acts of actually doing, of putting our faith into practice in some tiny, tiny way, but of making them seem tangible. So you might like to light a candle as a helpful act of prayer, because they are a visual way of almost seeing our prayer go up. Not that God's up, but here as well. It's symbolic. You know what I mean. So I wanted to invite you to a few moments of reflection, and then there'll be some singing, and feel free to move around and participate wherever you wish. But let me just open this short time in prayer. For the darkness of waiting, of not knowing what is to come, of staying ready and quiet and attentive, we praise you, O God. For the darkness and the light are both alike in you. For the darkness of hoping in a world which longs for you, for the wrestling and the labouring of all creation for wholeness and justice and freedom, we praise you, O God. For the darkness and the light are both alike in you. Amen.